This week, we talk about the history of rock music in the 1990s. And as we begin this week, our final week of part two here of this course, I think it's important to take just a minute to understand the kind of challenges that face us when we talk about relatively recent music and trying to gain some sense of historical perspective. As we get to the 90s, it's more difficult than it has been so far because it's the era that's closest to us. And in many ways, from a historical point of view, the dust hasn't really settled on that scene enough for us to get the clearest possible picture. Although every year as I teach this, of course, it gets clearer and clearer. And now I think we're starting to get the beginnings of a pretty clear picture. So the way I'm going to approach this week is with no claims that I'm giving the same kind of historical survey that we did before, but rather I'm going to look at the 90s for continuing threads that take us from the 70s, from the 80s into the 90s. So there's some of those for us to follow into the 1990s. I want to also talk a bit about styles that come up in the 90s but remind us of things that we've already studied during the course of part one and part two. And so we see things happening in the 90s that in many ways we've seen happening before. So what we're going to do this week is we're going to connect the emerging styles in the 90s to the previously studied ones, as I said before. We'll follow styles as they develop out of the 1980s, so the kinds of things we've been talking about in the last couple of weeks. We'll note the rise of the phenomenon of rock history. This really starts to happen in the 1990s and is one of the reasons why we can have a course like this, why people like me have been able to teach courses in universities and even high schools for the last couple of decades. This historical awareness really starts to arise in the 1990s, and we'll talk about that. And then we also have to understand the multi-generational nature that starts to happen in the 90s, where we'll start to see that artists from the 60s, artists from the 70s, and artists from the 80s all remain active at the same time. And so you get this sort of layering of different age groups, different demographics, all part of the rock scene beginning in the 90s. Of course, that continues even to the present day. So as I said just a minute ago, the artists and the bands that you hear me talk about here really are representatives. And a different person doing this, or me doing it a year from now, might change different artists to represent. So if you don't hear people from hear bands or artists from the 90s that you think should have been mentioned, all I'm really trying to do is sort of give a survey picture here. And so if you don't hear the band that is your favorite band or one that you think is important, just fill in the gaps for yourself as you go there, and keep your eye on the bigger picture. So let's follow one of those strands that comes out of the 80s. In our next lecture, we'll now turn to the rise of alternative rock.